the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. In the Shakespearean play The Merchant of Venice, the moneylender Shylock has made an agreement with Antonio that if he cannot repay his loan, Shylock will have a pound of flesh from Antonio. And so when the debt is not repaid in time, Portia at first pleads for mercy in a famous speech. The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes. But when Shylock refuses, she finally saves Antonio by pointing out that in Shylock's agreement with him, he had no mention of blood. And therefore, Shylock cannot have his pound of flesh, or can have his pound of flesh, rather, only if he sheds no blood. Portia uses the letter of the law to save Antonio. Our tax system is designed to have those with more wealth pay a larger percentage of tax, so that those who are struggling, those who are at the bottom end of our society, pay less. And yet our country can raise the needed funds that it needs to provide services. But wealthy individuals and large corporations, they find ways of drastically reducing the taxes that they pay. They use tax loopholes or write-offs. They shift money between countries, or they put it in offshore accounts. And it may be technically legal, but they are certainly not paying their fair share. The letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. As human beings, we love rules. We love laws, right? We like something that is black or white, so that we know what to do, or we know what not to do. We know how to act or how not to act. And we often secretly delight, don't we, when other people are punished for breaking a rule or a law. But when we get a speeding ticket or a parking ticket, but I was just running into the store for just a minute. Learning the rules, even the unwritten rules, is a common exercise. And Jesus knew that, which is why he takes the time to talk about rules in his Sermon on the Mount. He knew that he was in a rule-based society, so he decided to take a look at those rules and then to mess with everyone's head all at the same time. You thought you knew the rules, he seems to be saying. Well, listen to this. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. So, having just heard these verses, tell me, are you not a little overwhelmed? I mean, even a little bit? I mean, oh my goodness, rules are one thing, but this seems a bit much, doesn't it? I mean, we can all agree that murder is wrong, but I can't even be angry? I can't say to someone, you fool? These are extreme rules. They are intense rules. They are rules only for those who are really into rules, or something like that. I mean, we've evolved as a society, haven't we? We've kind of let most of this stuff slide. No big deal. Live and let live. Each to their own. But should we? I mean, we don't want to be sticks in the mud, yet reading these verses, it seems like this higher standard is something more than simply adding to the list of rules. It's as if Jesus is trying to help us realize something about ourselves and about our relationships. And that something might be as simple as pay attention. Or these relationships are really precious, treat them with care. Or maybe even that community is a gift from God. Don't waste it. Don't abuse it. Don't ignore it. Maybe I'm just wired this way, but it seems to me that all of these rules, all of these higher ways of living are about community. They are about relationships. And Jesus is saying that we shouldn't take any individual relationship and any community, we should not take them for granted. We shouldn't run the risk of hurting anyone. We shouldn't treat anyone as less than a child of God. And these aren't rules so much as a way of creating and sustaining a community that resembles God. Our passage begins with the most egregious example of a severed trust, right? The ending of another human life through murder. By starting with an example which most members of his audience and ours today would not likely take offense, Jesus opens the door, he paves the way for his audience to follow him through a progression of increasingly smaller infractions against each other in their own community. In other words, Jesus' rhetorical technique here is to create agreement with his audience on the easiest points first, before moving to those points where it is less and less likely that there will be widespread agreement. And so in each example that Jesus provides, Jesus notes the minimal requirement of the law, before then articulating, before telling them an ethic that exceeds, that goes higher than those most basic obligations. In each case, this ethic appears to be informed by the values of trust and compassion within community. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. And the contrast here is not of replacement, but of intensification. He's taking this rule and ratcheting it up. Jesus asks his listeners not to avoid these calls to righteousness, but in fact to dig into them even more, to align our lives so that we align with the divine values that these commandments communicate. We need to commit ourselves to that relationship and that transformative power of God's law and commandments. And so Jesus teaches it's insufficient to just avoid murdering someone else. Certain kinds of anger and insult can be forms of violence all on their own. We talk about sticks and stones, right? May break my bones, but names will never hurt me. We know that's not true. Names hurt. They're violent. Power and privilege, right? People that have it, whether it be individuals or countries, in many ways we can affect death on others, whether we intend to or not. Think about climate change and how the world's wealthiest countries have emitted the most greenhouse gases over the past century, and yet how it's the entire world, especially the poor, who are going to pay for it. The prohibition of taking someone else's life has always extended to include a prohibition against dealing death in less explicit but no less destructive ways. But then Jesus raises the stakes here even higher. Reconciliation, right, is a prerequisite for coming before God at the altar. What if broken relationships with neighbors and family and friends are not just social obstacles among us, but instead a barometer of our relationship with God? What if the opposite of murder is not just avoiding killing, but reparative reconciliation? The command not to murder extends even beyond the taking of a life. That even sullying someone's character is embodied in the command not to murder. Relationality is itself a way to draw nearer to God, who calls us to act with righteousness. And so also the prohibition of adultery extends beyond any single act to a whole orientation around relationships. I mean, here we have a biblical context taught by Jesus himself, that it is the call of those who gaze, not upon those whom we gaze. That we who gaze must discipline our hearts and our desires. For too long and in too many cultures, we have taught that it is the duty of women to shield their bodies so they don't tempt us men. And Jesus here teaches exactly the opposite. And from adultery, Jesus moves to divorce. And divorce was a very divisive thing in Jesus' day, with two opposite sides firmly entrenched. On one side, a man could divorce a woman simply by saying it 3 times. And on the other, divorce was not allowed at all. And don't forget that later in this Gospel of Matthew, in chapter 19, some Pharisees actually seek out Jesus' opinion on the matter of divorce. It was a very hot topic. During Jesus' time, women who were divorced would have been included in the group that Jesus says we must help: the poor, the widowed, and the orphan. Suddenly they were cast out. They had nothing. And so there was an argument against divorce. And yet, sometimes divorce was needed, especially when a relationship was ruptured. Jesus' teachings on divorce, it provides us with a helpful foundation for understanding the final instruction in our passage related to the making of vows. At first, Jesus' teaching on the proper way to make vows might seem like an odd candidate for an example of how he is promoting an ethic of trust and compassion within human relationships. But if we think of it when it is set within that ancient context, right, where most dealings between people, most agreements, whether in business or family or friends, most agreements were spoken. Nothing was written down. So one's word, one's promise, would have carried something like the weight of one's signature today. It seems nearly unimaginable to be able to engage in business today, right, without a signature, without a contract, without lots and lots of paperwork. But the business practices of Jesus' day, they would have been rendered impossible if you couldn't trust a person's word or promise. And so the oral strengthening of these vows, by attaching them to something of great importance, right? The example that Jesus gives when we swear to heaven, or we swear to the earth, or we swear by God, those vows might have served a purpose not unlike the verification of a document by a notary today. But again, Jesus is not satisfied to leave it at this. He suggests that we say our yes is yes, right? That we don't have to swear. All we have to do is say yes. That our spoken word, our promises are so authentic and so in line with our intentions that it is already beyond question. When I say yes, it means yes, I will do that. I agree. I will follow through. In other words, Jesus is calling for us to demonstrate the highest possible level of trustworthiness and integrity, not only in our dealings with other humans, but more especially in our dealings with God. It's all about the spirit of the law, not the letter. What matters most here is not behavior, but relationality, how we connect and how we honor those relationships. And in the end, to what are these commandments calling us to? According to Jesus, it's not a checklist of morality. It is about a flourishing of life, of communal life, of relational life. It's not a baseline of decency, but it's a call to an embodied, relational, transformative encounter with all whom we meet. It's not a sufficient set of hurdles that we cross over, that we can make it over, we can scrape by, and suddenly we are righteous. It is about being a path laid before us to wholeness within ourselves, with each other, and with God. It's not easy, and we will make mistakes. But just like our children's story this morning, we have God's magic bag of forgiveness. It's in our trying over and over again that we make ourselves and the world a better place. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Amen. Let us respond in song. Our hymn is number 451, Dear Father, Lord of Humankind, and it's sung by Mary Ann McVicker.